Welcome to Chapter 17 of Price Analysis, a fundamental approach to the study of commodity prices. This chapter is a little bit different than the previous chapters because we're going to be talking about crude oil and the crack spread. The rest of the course has been exclusively focused on agricultural commodity markets, both storable and non-storable. But since crude oil is such an important commodity in the world marketplace, I felt like we needed to wrap up the book with a little bit of a treatment about how crude oil commodity markets work. So that's what this chapter does. So most crude oil exists because a bunch of sea life fell to the bottom of the ocean, and that biological material became buried further and further under more and more layers of sediment and other biological material. And over time, as that biological material is exposed to really great heat and pressure, it gets transformed into crude oil. So at its root, crude oil is really just a mix of different hydrocarbon molecules. And when you break these molecules down and recombine them in different configurations, you can go from having crude oil to different materials like gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil, and jet fuel. So it's really just when you hear about refining crude oil, it's really about splitting apart those hydrocarbons and making them reconfigure in different ways to produce different kinds of quote-unquote refined fuel. Now, before we go further, I invite you to watch this video that was produced by the publication The Atlantic. I'm not going to play it here in the middle of this video, but they do a really nice job of a very basic introductory level about what is crude oil and why it produces valuable products that we would value highly in our current economic marketplace. So check that out, and then we'll continue with this lecture. So the first distinction to understand in the crude oil market is the different types of crude oil, and that's going to be covered here in section 17.1. So you've probably heard of light sweet crude oil, and there's also light sour crude oil. There's also heavy sweet and heavy sour. So light and heavy are is a kind of way to characterize crude oil, and also sweet versus sour is another way to characterize crude oil. So light versus heavy simply means how long the chain of hydrocarbon molecules the crude oil is made of. So if a given deposit of crude oil contains oil that has very large hydrocarbon molecules, it's heavy. If the crude oil happens to be composed of smaller hydrocarbon molecules, then it's called light. And it turns out that light crude oil can be more easily turned into higher value products like gasoline and distillates. So the lighter the crude oil, usually the more valuable it is. So the light versus heavy creates a value differential when you're talking about buying crude oil on the open market. Another characteristic of light versus heavy crude oil is that light crude oil flows more freely, while heavy crude oil is more viscous. And there's this measure called the American Petroleum Institute gravity. You may have heard of API gravity. That's a measure of how heavy crude oil is compared to water. And the benchmark is sort of an API gravity of 10. If crude oil's API gravity is greater than 10, then it will float on water. If it's less than 10, the crude oil will sink. And it turns out that crude oil is considered light if it has an API gravity of higher than about 31.1 degrees. So that's light versus heavy crude oil. Now let's talk about sweet versus sour crude oil. Sweet versus sour simply refers to the amount of sulfur content that's in the crude oil. So sweet crude oil contains less than 0.5% sulfur. And it makes it easier to refine because the sulfur doesn't have to be removed before selling the final product. And the sulfur content of diesel is regulated, and diesel in the United States and Europe has to have a very limited quantity of sulfur. You may have heard people talking about diesel by calling it ultra low sulfur diesel. And that sulfur content is related to whether the crude oil is sweet versus sour. Also, sulfur is really corrosive, so that if you're refining really sour crude oil, then it may means that you're going to have increased maintenance costs for refineries. I think that's a pretty good place to cut the videos for this chapter, so I'm going to end the video here, and I will see you guys in the next segment.